Hello there. Today I'm delighted to be sharing with you a wine from Bonny Doon. This is Randall Graham's winery. This is the 2019 Cigare Volant. And Randall Grahm has been a huge character in the California wine scene for most of the last 40 years. Randall, it's hard to define. He's something of a philosopher. He's certainly, for most of his time, been an iconoclast who's almost become an icon in himself. He's creative, he's distinctive, and he's produced a large number of wines with very eye-catching names. I think he's a showman is probably a good way of suggesting that. And a lot of this has been to suggest that the wines he's making relate to initially Rhone wines and then wines from Italy. Initially, Randall's always claimed that he set out to make the great American Pinot Noir. And to that end, in the early 80s, I have two dates actually for the establishment of Bonny Doon, 1981 and 1983. So whether one is the creation of the company and the other is the planting of the vineyard, I'm not quite sure. But Bonny Doon, south of Santa Cruz in the hills, was a winery that towards the end of the 80s actually was wiped out by something called Pierce's disease, a dreadful disease that stops the sap from flowing up the vine and causes them to wilt and die eventually. So through this period, Randall produced many memorable wine names, wine labels, marketed those. So we saw wines such as the Clos de Gilroy, the Old Telegram in homage of the Châteauneuf-du-Pape Vieux Telegraphe. He created Cardinal Zin. He produced a wine from Madrin in France that was called the Heart of Darkness. There were Italian wineries, Il Pescatore. He planted a vineyard near the prison in Soledad, and the wines from there were initially called Cal del Solo, the House of Solitude. And I think those are what eventually came to be known as the Big House Red. There are other wines. Bloody Good Red, for instance, was one of his. Or he produced at one stage a wine called Le Sophiste, which actually came off his vineyard at one of the last wines to come off the vineyard at Bonny Doon. It was a Marsanne-Roussanne blend in a high-shouldered bottle with a plastic top hat set jauntily on top of the wine there. Randall produced a wine called Vin de Glacière at one stage, where he picked muscat grapes, taken them, used an industrial freezer, and then pressed them once frozen to produce an ice wine, essentially. And Randall always had sort of an eye for grabbing attention. I mean, in the mid-80s, he appeared on the cover of Wine Spectator at one stage, sort of with a horse, dressed as the Lone Ranger with the mask on and everything else. And thus he acquired the sobriquet of the Rhône Ranger. And I think he really was the person who's defined as that. Today, the Rhône Rangers are really a movement of people interested in growing Rhone grape varieties in California. Randall has always suggested that these are probably the best varieties to grow in the climatic conditions that they have there. And he really was a pioneer of this movement. And as I say, I think that's where the name came from. But in 2006, he changed his approach and actually sold off some of his bigger brands. So sold off the Big House Red, sold off Cardinal Zin, and then in 2010 he sold another brand, the Pacific Rim. So Randall's very much trying to come back to his more small production, individualistic wines, and more to the sort of the original ethos that he'd had with Bonny Doon. Le Cigare Volant itself, the name, quite peculiar name, stems from the fact that according to Randall, in 1954 the town council of Châteauneuf-du-Pape decided that it was concerned about the landing of flying saucers in the vineyards, so cigar, and thus passed an ordinance, a local ordinance, to prohibit that. And in fact went further than that. They said that if flying saucers landed in the vineyards, they should be taken to the pound. And Randall's always maintained that no flying saucers have landed anywhere in the vineyards of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, so it's been quite a successful move, really. This is the 35th vintage produced of Le Cigare Volant. And actually, in the previous year, 2018, and also more so in 2019, there has been a move more towards making Cigare Volant a more approachable wine when young, in making it less expensive while trying to keep something of its character. For instance, in 2019, they've not included any Mourvedre in the blend, which they had done consistently for several vintages beforehand. So it had been in classic Australian terms, a Grenache, Syrah's Mourvedre, and in 2019 the Mourvedre is replaced largely by Cinsaut, actually, which had been used before, but not in perhaps quite as large a volume. This wine is actually 56% of Grenache with 30% of Cinsaut. There's 13% of Syrah, and then the final percentage consists of Petit Syrah. As is typical of Le Cigare Volant, this isn't a terroir wine. It's a composed wine. This particular vintage comes from 6 vineyards, but actually nowhere in the 35 years that this has been produced has any one vineyard appeared in every vintage. So really it's created afresh every year from the fruit sources that Randall has available to him. There's not really an awful lot of information about the winemaking for this wine. There are some notes that suggest with 2019 being quite cool that the Grenache element in the wine was quite fresh, quite lifted, quite perfumed, and a pretty wine. Whereas the Cinsaut was really quite successful because they worked really hard to keep the yields low. There was quite a bunch thinning going on, so crop being dropped. And part of the success of the wine this year is that they managed to co-ferment the Cinsaut with Syrah, and Randall's view is very much that when the two are fermented together you get a situation where actually the result is greater than the sum of its parts, so you get better colour fixing, you get better tannins than you would if you'd have made the two wines separately and blended them. I've also seen notes that suggest that this is a wine that aged in French oak, but there's nothing there to suggest whether all of it aged in French oak, how long it aged for, whether the oak was new, whether it was large barrels, small barrels, older oak, no details whatsoever. The other thing I've seen is that they produced somewhere in the region of 2,400 cases of this in 2019, which is quite a substantial increase. A few years before that they were producing sort of 1,200, 1,300 cases a year. So there's been a move to reduce the price, make the wine more accessible, and also to produce more of it. So let's see what we make of the wine, shall we? My first impression is that there's a lovely vibrancy to the colour. It's quite darkly pigmented ruby red, but it's not particularly deep. It's relatively translucent. I can see through it quite easily. So there's probably a medium depth of colour there. Let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas are of fresh red cherry, and actually one of the notes, I didn't see much about the winemaking for this vintage, but Randall does talk about the fact that they use a certain amount of reduction, so protecting the wine from oxygen to give the wine quite a sort of a savoury note. And here I'm sort of getting a little bit of that. There's quite an almost a meatiness, but initially you're getting notes of juicy, bright red cherry, and then this reduction note is coming on top of that, just keeping it in check, restraining it a little. The wine is 13.5% alcohol. There are some tears flowing down the glass, but they're not doing so particularly readily. So let's taste. Initially, there's a really fresh red fruit. It's that juicy red cherries that we saw on the aromas, and they're really very pronounced to begin with, and then suddenly you get a real change. There's almost a sort of a chocolatey smoothness comes in on the palate, and then you move through to a much more concentrated, initially sweet licorice, and then you get some tannic bite coming in, which gives it more of a sort of bitter licorice character. The wine is probably medium to medium full-bodied, but it's not hugely structured, or it doesn't appear so. You're not getting the oak tannins. There aren't notes of cedar, there aren't sort of grainy notes. And actually there are tannins there, because they're giving that tannic grip to the finish there, and that's where you're seeing a little bit of spiciness, perhaps a tiny touch of pepper, but you're also seeing these savoury, reductive notes, and those are actually quite akin to notes you might see with a Rhône wine, something like a Gigondas or something like that. So I think this particular wine is actually quite true to what Randall Grahm originally set out to do with Cigare Volant, to produce very much a wine in the style of the Rhone Valley. I think in terms of its balance, There's a lovely balance between freshness. I didn't really remark too much on the alcohol. That's nicely in balance, and it's allowing the fruit, some of the freshness of the fruit and some of the sort of savoury notes of the fruit to come through to a fairly lengthy finish. So you've got balanced acidity, balanced alcohol, quite a nice concentration of fruit. I would imagine that that's a wine that will age quite happily for 8 to 10 years. It perhaps might not achieve the 15-20 years aging that earlier vintages might have managed, but nonetheless I think a really enjoyable wine, and one that is quite approachable now. So yeah, an interesting wine. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you found the tasting interesting. If you have enjoyed it, do please press the like button. Do consider sharing it with your friends if you think they'd be interested. Do think about signing up and following us on YouTube. We'd love to have your support. Do leave any comments you have in the comments box below, either about the wine, about the tasting, or anything else related to that. But most importantly, do please make sure you join us for another tasting in the very near future. Thanks again. Bye for now.